Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and due to a new version of Last Alliance Total War being released, I'm here with a new video breaking down the newest faction added to the mod, the Republic of Breeland. If you're new here, the Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2, set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War The Dawnless Days, a mod for Total War Attila set in the Third Age instead. As of making this video, the mod is in development, being in the version 0.3.3 alpha. While they're somewhat early in the mod's development, there's still a fair bit of content in the mod with several factions and a small campaign being ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave a link in the description and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, as I said, will be a faction breakdown, with me going over the history within both the books and films of Tolkien's universe of the Republic of Breeland, before looking at the civilizations that inspired it in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the faction's units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. Breeland is a region in western Middle-earth close to the Shire, its main feature being the settlement of Bree, the area mainly being inhabited by humans, although as the Third Age continued, hobbits would migrate to the area and found the Shire, before integrating with the humans of Bree. In the Second Age of Middle-earth, there is nothing known of Bree or any government in the area, so this faction for all intents and purposes is a creation of the modders. The only thing we can really glean from it being that Breeland would have been relatively well defended during the Second Age of Middle-earth due to being close to the elven realm of Lindon. Also, I believe this area would eventually fall under the dominion of the Kingdom of Arnor after it was founded, and that would then break away after the destruction of that kingdom and its remnants, although that would occur during the Third Age, millennia after this mod's setting, nothing being known of the inhabitants of the region's actions during the War of the Last Alliance. Breeland appears quite prominently in the Lord of the Rings books and films, Bree being Frodo's first experience with the world outside the Shire, and the location where he encounters Aragorn, Bree itself not showing up in the Hobbit book, although it is seen in the Desolation of Smaug, if only briefly, showing off the Prancing Pony Inn where several key events would unfold in the Third Age. In terms of historical cultures which could have inspired the faction, the main thing that stands out to me are the fortified independent townships and surrounding regions of Western Europe during the Middle Ages, such as the cantons of Switzerland, as well as the city-states of ancient Greece like Athens or Thebes, in which locals defended their homes more so than professional armies. With the history of the faction both in and out of the universe looked at, let's move on to the units themselves. Unlike the Dawnless Days, in which generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only having two generals, the Republic of Breeland having two general options. The first of these options are the Breeland Gentry Guard, which like their name suggests is made up of the higher class citizens of the area. Looking at each man in the unit, they're quite well equipped, all having helmets that resemble Ottoman-style acorn helmets with adjustable cheek guards like those of Roman Gallic-style helmets, a nasal guard helping to give the helmet a unique shape. Attached to the back of the helmet to give extra protection is an aventail of scale, such a feature being seen on many helmets historically. The helmet resembles a more basic version of the helmet used by the Númenóreans, perhaps indicating a cultural and military exchange between the two cultures, which would make sense given Númenor's influence over Middle-earth during the Second Age. For body armour, they have a scale hauberk over an arming doublet, with attached mail sleeves, the hauberk giving them a look reminiscent of the Rohirrim and their Anglo-Saxon inspirations. Protecting their arms, they have spolders and pauldrons, or protecting their forearms over their sleeves, they have a variety of plate van braces, some resembling more transitionary period armour of the early to mid-1300s, while others look like early 15th century pieces, the hands however remaining unarmoured. For their shins they have greaves, while the feet are protected only by leather boots, the look being capped off by green cloaks over their backs. In general, they resemble well-equipped 10th century warriors with a few pieces of armour that wouldn't see use for centuries. In addition to their armour, each man has a wooden shield that looks like a cross between a kite shield and a pavise, having the square shape of a pavise but the rounded end of a kite shield, the shield being rimmed in metal, which is historical for both kinds of aforementioned shield. While this shield looks to be a fantasy creation, it isn't solely seen used by this faction, as the Númenórean factions in the game use similar, if not identical shields, perhaps more evidence towards the exchange between both cultures. Such a shield generally makes sense for warriors with this level of armour, as kite shields were commonly used by well-equipped warriors in the 11th to 12th centuries, while pavise shields were used by lesser equipped troops in the late Middle Ages, who these warriors' armour would be more or less analogous to. These shields in question are painted and then emblazoned with the white symbol of the Prancing Pony, a suitable symbol for the faction given that it appears that its leadership is based off of a fictional ancestral owner of the Prancing Pony Inn, who doubles as the leader of the faction. For weapons, the men utilize bastard swords out of the late 14th century, the weapons useful in either one or two hands, and complementing their shield well. such a weapon not being a bad choice for these troops given the limitation that their shields place on them, although perhaps warhammers or maces would be more effective at killing unarmoured foes, or armoured foes. Looking at their unit officer, he appears identical to his men except that his helmet looks to be somewhat more reinforced and gilded, rather than the bronze or copper highlights we see on the other soldiers' helmets. As a unit, these guys are a fairly cost-effective general unit, being a standard sliding sword and shield general which boosts the power of the faction and serves as a good frontline unit that can pivot between offensive and defensive maneuvers. Able to form a shield wall, they can hold the line very well, though it must be said against some of the more illustrious generals in the mod, the relative mediocrity of these guys begins to shine. Overall, a useful unit that gives the Republic of Bree a starting point from which to lead their battles, however the faction does have better available to it. Just what constitutes better are these guys, the Butterbur Guard led by Davin Butterbur, just called Butterbur, who is for all intents and purposes the leader of the faction, as well as the ancestor of Barlaam Butterbur, the owner of the Prancing Pony Inn during the War of the Ring. The Butterbur Guard are equipped identically to the previous unit when it comes to armour and even use the same bastard sword. However, they drop shields and instead use longbows, a weapon that is most associated with the archers of England who used the weapon to devastating effect during the 100 Years' War primarily, as well as during the War of the Roses during the 14th and 15th centuries. These longbows look pretty good to me, and it's fun to note that these warriors won't need to worry about their bows slapping their forearms due to their van braces. Looking at Darren Butterbur, he's equipped mostly identically to his men, however his helmet doesn't have an avantal and instead extends back to protect his neck, similar to a Sallee or Corinthian helmet, while the brow of said helmet is emblazoned with the white symbol of the prancing pony, helping to distinguish him. Apart from his more ornate helmet, Butterbur also has a breastplate over the top of his scale hauberk, the breastplate also showing an enamelled prancing pony emblem, the armour piece looking straight out of the 15th century. Turning to the unit role, these guys are obviously an archer general unit who can mix it up in melee when necessary. While not quite as sturdy frontline defenders like the previous unit, they are an excellent option when playing as a defender in sieges as they combine additional firepower and combat prowess, making for a great combination. That said, however, they are more vulnerable to archer fire due to their lack of shields, and are also doomed if caught out by mounted foes. Overall, a very useful unit, but one which excels in certain circumstances over others. With these guys covered, let's turn to the regular units fielded by the faction, beginning with their only spear unit, the Breeland Town Watchers. For helmets, these warriors use the same style as the previous unit. However, these helmets lack gilding as well as avantales. For body armour, they tend to wear gambeson shirts over which they have sleeveless mail hauberks, straight out of the 10th century, some in the unit wearing surcoats over their hauberks bearing the prancing pony emblem. Apart from the hauberks, the only armour they have of various styles are plate van braces like those used by the Butterbur Guard, meaning that their legs are unprotected mostly. Using the same shields we've seen before, these troops use spears with large heads that look like the spears of the early Middle Ages, which were competent at both stabbing and cutting, the spears working well in combination with their large shields. In addition to these spears, the men have axes at their side which resemble hatchets to use in close quarters. The axe is very much reminiscent of Viking-era weapons. The officer is identical to the rank-and-file soldiers of the general units, except that he bears a spear as his primary weapon with an arming sword at his side. As a unit, these guys are your standard spear unit and are your only option when it comes to that category, meaning that they are vital when it comes to army building, being the core of your front line which is perfect for fending off enemy horsemen, the ability to take up spear war formation making them that much more formidable. True, they will fall to elite shock infantry and won't score massive amounts of kills, but buying time for the rest of your army to go into action is what they're there for. Overall, a prerequisite unit as far as I'm concerned for victories if you want to play as this faction, seeing use all the way into late game armies. Moving on to the melee infantry that the Republic of Breeland can field, we come to the Breeland Field Watchers. Just by looking at these troops you can tell they're militia, essentially farmhands who have been given whatever equipment is available, which is why they're so lightly equipped. When it comes to helmets, they wear both the avantal and non-avantal version of what appears to be the faction's standard helmet. However, some lack helmets altogether and wear Phrygian caps, this lack of helmets being an obvious issue when engaging in combat. We'll get back to this issue soon. For body armour, they wear a mix of gambeson or just their daily clothes, some having mail shirts over which they have a chaperon, the medieval version of a hoodie for all intents and purposes, otherwise completely lacking armour. While such lightly armoured troops are most definitely seen on historical battlefields, these men's combination of equipment doesn't make sense. The most important bit of armour anyone would prioritise would be a helmet, given how important your head is. The warriors who wear gambeson but only have caps for their heads make sense, given that gambeson could be produced fairly easily and cheaply, so it makes sense for these troops to have gambeson for body protection but still be lacking helmets. However, the troops who wear mail shirts but lack helmets make no sense, given that mail was quite expensive, so unless these guys have been looting the dead after battles, it wouldn't make sense for them to have mail shirts but no helmets. Turning to the rest of their equipment, they use wooden bucklers rimmed with metal. Such shields have been highly historical and also commonly seen in the hands of lighter infantry like these men. For weapons, they use the axes used by the spearmen, which makes sense. Axes being a ubiquitous weapon due to their cheap price and usability as both a weapon and a tool in day-to-day life. The unit officers are equipped identically to the regular spearmen when it comes to armor. He, however, uses an axe and a buckler rather than a large shield and spear. As a unit, these are a building block of early armies, more or less able to match equivalent starting militia and rabble, although they are very vulnerable to archers and horsemen and should be replaced as quickly as possible. A necessary unit to field, but not one which you want to have fighting against up-tiered foes. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Breeland West Axemen. When it comes to armour, these troops all have the standard helmet, which is nice to see, for body armour having either gambeson or mail shirts, meaning that they're still quite lightly armoured. Dropping shields, they use what are essentially Dane axes, long, two-handed axes perfect for carving up foes and making a path through enemy formations. Dane axes being most notably used by Viking warriors as well as Anglo-Saxon Huscarls and the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire. Skipping the unit officer who's a standard elite officer wielding a Dane axe, these guys are your standard shock infantry, being a cut above the previous unit when it comes to combat prowess. Excelling at tearing apart enemy formations, these guys shouldn't be relied on to hold the line as they're not cut out for being on the defensive, also being somewhat useful at cutting down slack enemy cavalry, although typically cavalry pose an immense threat to these guys if caught out of position. The only shock infantry unit properly afforded to the faction, these guys are going to be a must-have for any Breeland general, although you should keep them away from archers. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Breeland City Guards, who are the sword infantry equivalent of the Breeland Town Watchers, using arming swords in combination with the large shields instead of spears, the officer being the same elite officer except that he too uses an arming sword and shield. As a unit, these guys are your mid-tier sword infantry who work well in combination with the spearmen, being more than capable of slaughtering low-tier rabble while able to hold off equivalent foes. Getting them as quickly as possible is imperative, as they're a major step up from the Breeland Field Watchers, being actual soldiers rather than armed peasants. Overall, a very useful unit which helps make Breeland capable of holding its own against its myriad enemies in the mid-game. Moving on to the final melee infantry unit the faction can field, we have the Breeland Gentry, who for all intents and purposes are pretty much the Breeland Gentry Guard general unit, except capable of being fielded in large numbers. Role-wise, these guys are your late-game professional infantry who can duke it out with most other equivalent units, although it should be said that some of the more powerful factions in the mod have even more elite units designed to be vanguards in battle, these guys not really being a straight match for such units, Breeland as a whole not really having any such unit to answer this threat. Overall, a critical unit to be fielded in conjunction with the Breeland Town Watchers if you want a competent late-game army. With these guys covered, all of the factions' melee infantry have been looked at, so we'll move on to their ranged units beginning with the Breeland Hunters. As their name suggests, these are the hunters who live in the woods and fields around Bree, completely lacking armour and instead just wearing their daily outfits with caps atop their heads, their clothing being a mix of browns and green meant to make it more easy for them to camouflage from their prey. At their sides they carry hatchets, while their main weapons are the longbows we've seen before, skipping their non-existent unit officer. As a unit, these hunters provide early Breeland armies with range support that is desperately needed, the unit having a range advantage over skirmishers, helping to balance out the battlefield. While they are useful early on, these guys can't endure much in the way of punishment, be it via arrow exchanges, melee, or especially cavalry, so keep in mind that they're quite fragile. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Breeland Company of Archers, essentially the bow equivalent of the Town Watchers and City Guard, wearing mail vests and helmets helping to keep them alive, although instead of van braces they use leather braces. While leather braces generally aren't historical, for archers it makes sense for them to have them to protect them from bow slap, although it should probably be only on their bow holding arm, not both arms. Using a longbow as their main weapon, these troops also have axes at their side in case they get caught in battle. Led by the standard elite officer wielding a longbow, these guys are your professional archer force, being a match for most archers at that level while being capable of raining death on rabble bowmen and skirmishers. However, the elves possess a greater affinity with the bow, and as such these guys are at a disadvantage when facing off against elven archers and even elite Numenorian troops. Overall, a key support unit that gives the faction hitting power at range. However, the Republic of Breeland has another unit that works well in conjunction with them, the Breeland Burghers Crossbowmen. More heavily armoured than the previous unit, these troops wear gambeson over which they have mail hauberks, some of which are covered by surcoats and tabards. In addition to this armour, they also have plate van braces giving them that extra bit of protection. Slung over their backs they have the standard large shield used by the faction, which is analogous to history, when crossbowmen would have large shields like pavisas over their back to protect them from return shots while they reloaded. At their sides, each man has an arming sword rather than an axe, or their main weapons are crossbows reminiscent of those used in the late Middle Ages. Although in universe I'm pretty sure these crossbows are manufactured and used by the Dwarven factions, which makes sense, suggesting that these weapons have been sold to the men of Breeland by the Dwarves. Skipping their crossbow-equipped officer, these guys are another potential option for ranged professional power, being more durable than the company archers, but lacking somewhat in range and power. In my honest opinion, I don't think one is that much more useful than the other, and instead I recommend combining the two, using them both as your ranged arm, providing each other support when needed. With all these guys covered, all the ranged infantry of the faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to the final category of unit the faction can field, Cavalry, beginning with the Breeland Militia. Mounted on unarmoured horses, the riders are essentially the Breeland Field Watchers but on horseback, using spears in combination with their bucklers, their appearance reminding me of the Hobblars, light cavalry that saw constant action on the Anglo-Scottish border during the late Middle Ages. Skipping the officer, who's a low-tier officer on horseback with shield and spear, these guys are relatively light cavalry who give the faction significant advantage over other factions who due to lacking cavalry are quite immobile, perfect at performing hit-and-run actions on archers and even useful at charging into undefended enemy flanks and rears. These guys should be recruited for early to mid-game armies, as they do give this faction an edge it would otherwise be missing. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Breeland Riders of the Great Road, who while still riding unarmoured horses are better equipped, being the Breeland Town Watchers on horseback, using their kite shield-inspired shields alongside spears, giving the unit a faint resemblance to Norman cavalry of the 11th century. Skipping the elite officer on horseback, these guys fulfill the role of medium to heavy cavalry, being your mobile armoured fist in the late game, capable of not only launching devastating charges on enemy infantry, but also fighting off most opposing horsemen. With these guys covered, every unit in the faction has been looked at, so let's move on to the faction as a whole. The Republic of Breeland is a faction that has a very basic playstyle, having alright units across the board, but not really excelling in any area, their main saving grace being that their cavalry gives them mobility and hitting power that other factions lack, being somewhat of a midpoint between the cavalry-oriented Haradrim factions and the infantry-oriented Numenorians. Overall, not a standout faction, but I like that it gives you a more realistic example of what the regular humans of Middle-earth can field, as opposed to the immensely powerful Numenorians, Elves, and Dwarves. As far as I'm concerned, cavalry is the way to go with these guys. A good old hammer and anvil strategy not really going wrong. With all that said, my breakdown of the Republic of Breeland is over, and up until more changes are made to the mod, this will be my last video in my series breaking down the Last Alliance Total Wars factions, although battle videos and army builds should be coming up, and given how quickly the modders work, a new update shouldn't be far in the future. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's greatly appreciated. This is your host Jakov, signing out.